Welcome to our discussion of the ordeal of Floyd Collins. With us today to talk about the tragedy that faced Collins in January of 1925 is Professor Robert K. Murray of the Department of History at Penn State University, co-author with Roger Brucker of the book Trapped. I'm David Lee of the Department of History at Western Kentucky University, and this is Tom Chaney, a dairy farmer from Horse Cave in Hart County. Professor Murray, why don't you start by showing us some slides and telling us a little bit about the situation that Floyd Collins found himself in 1925.
All right, thank you, David. We're going to have some slides on the screen now to set the frame of reference for our discussion. We're talking about this man, Floyd Collins, a central Kentuckian who was the discoverer of Crystal Cave in 1917. Floyd, however, found that tourists did not come to his cave because it was far off the beaten path. You'll notice that he's far away from the access routes from Cave City and Park City. Most of his tourists, potential tourists, went to Mammoth Cave instead, and Floyd was interested in finding some means whereby he could siphon them off, and therefore was looking for a closer entrance into Crystal Cave than the one he had. As a result, you see Sand Cave marked there on the map. Floyd decided to see if he could find such an opening, and came to this spot on the uplands adjoining Flint Ridge with Mammoth Cave Ridge, known as Sand Cave. This opening, he decided to go down in it and see what he could find. This he did on January the 30th, 1925. Floyd went in about 115 feet and was down about 55 feet when a limestone block fell from the ceiling and trapped him. It fell on his left foot, pinning him, debris falling down from the ceiling, trapping his arms as well, so that in a position like in a barber chair, inclining slightly upward, Floyd was covered with dirt and was in an earthen straitjacket. Now at this point, his friends and relatives began to gather to try to get him out. Here you see two of his brothers and his father arrived on the scene about 4 hours later trying to find where Floyd was. They tried to get down to him. They found that only one man could work there at a time, and they could come in only wriggling on their bellies, head to head, talking to Floyd, but being unable to extricate him. After they failed, trying everything they could, outsiders began to arrive, hearing of Floyd's plight. Here are miners who came from southern Indiana, from southern Ohio, from Muhlenberg County in Kentucky, in an attempt to give their services to get Floyd Collins out of his earthen coffin. The gentleman in the upper left-hand corner, which is barely visible there, became one of the chief rescuers. He was a young 20-year-old cub reporter who was sent down from the Louisville Courier-Journal to report on the story, and stayed to become one of the chief persons trying to get Floyd Collins out. His name was William Burke Miller, nicknamed Skeets because he was so small. He was only 5'4" and weighed 110 pounds, and was one of the few who could make his way down to where Floyd had wriggled. Not long after these various attempts failed and a cave-in occurred just above Floyd's head, cutting him off from potential rescuers, other outsiders came. These individuals came at the request of the governor of Kentucky, who, worried about the confusion at the cave and the inability to get Floyd out, called out the National Guard under the command of General Denhart. General Denhart and a contingent of some over 50 National Guardsmen moved in, set up tents, and thereafter took over the responsibility for trying to get Floyd from his situation. Not long afterwards, engineers and specialists came in. They decided to sink a shaft and set up this operation. You'll notice the bucket going down into a 6-foot by 6-foot heading that went down into the ground through very sloppy conditions, since it was February by this time, and groundwater was making the area very mushy. They, of course, were trying to drive a shaft 55 feet to where Floyd was and get him out directly in that way. By this time, of course, it had become national news. The press throughout the country now played up Floyd's plight, and he was, in a form, a kind of a hero. Americans, being curious as they are, came to the scene in droves. Here's a 4-mile-long traffic jam outside of Sand Cave on February the 8th, a Sunday, when people converged on Sand Cave hoping to see a man in death throes. Of course, they saw no such thing. They were kept away from the heading by barbed wire that had been set up, and a kind of a carnival atmosphere resulted instead, where hamburgers were sold and balloons and artifacts of one sort or another from the cave country. Floyd, meanwhile, dying under their feet. In the end, the heading came in at a spot not exactly near Floyd, and a lateral had to be sent off, which unfortunately came in at Floyd's head instead of his foot, on which the limestone rock still rested. As a consequence, because of the dangers involved in men working there any longer, they simply decided to leave Floyd where he was. A funeral was held on February the 16th because when they got there, Floyd was dead. Here is Reverend Beiser of the central Kentucky area giving a eulogy, standing on a stump. Floyd's stepmother is there in the lower right-hand corner dabbing her eyes. This was to be Floyd's last rites. No corpse, no grave, and Floyd was left where he was. But not for long. The family decided somewhat later to hire 6 professional miners to go down and see if they couldn't get Floyd out when the ground had become drier and things had become more solidified, and they were successful in doing so. 3 months later, indeed in April of 1925, they finally got Floyd's body out of its straitjacket, earthen grip, and there you see Floyd on a litter just after they had brought him up from the ground. Floyd's body by this time had been more or less mummified as a result of the natural conditions that the body lay in while it was under the ground. In the end, Floyd was finally buried in his beloved Crystal Cave. If you look in the lower center portion of this picture, you'll find a black spot there, which is Floyd's coffin. A little closer, and you'll see Floyd there. That's the coffin. It's still there. Crystal is closed, of course, to the public. It's no longer available for the general public to pass by. The tombstone reads William Floyd Collins, as you can see, the greatest cave explorer ever known, it says on that tombstone. Now, Floyd became a legend by this time. His fame had spread throughout the United States. People identified with his plight. They had worried about him. They had prayed for him. And now, after he was gone, people began to exploit his death in one way or another. Here's the sheet music of the death of Floyd Collins, which was the most popular song of any country western song of this period, selling over 1 million copies. Here are the record. This one by Columbia, but it was on 17 different labels before it was done. And off to the right, barely visible there on your screen, is a piano player roll. I'm sure some of you know the old player pianos, and people bought these piano player rolls, The Death of Floyd Collins, The Ballad of Floyd Collins, for $1, and pumped them out on their living room player pianos. Floyd, as I say, a legend by this time. In reconstructing this story, we, of course, had to separate truth from myth, and in the end, we actually decided to go back into Sand Cave. Sand Cave has been closed. It was closed, of course, by the federal government after the national park was created, but it was closed before that to anyone. The sign reads closed on it. This is a picture of Sand Cave in 1980, and if you go there, you'll see it in just this way. We received permission to go back in the cave, and if you'll notice, here is one of the explorers, young explorers, moving down into the cave, beckoning you to come inside. You'll notice how his body is going laterally as he drops down through the first opening, a very scary, frightening, difficult place to get into. As our cavers went down farther, they came across these artifacts that are still there from the rescue in 1925, and we left them there. Good cavers leave things where they find them. Here's a poker. You'll notice there are medicine bottles. Here's a blue Coke bottle on the extreme left. If you look close on the right, you'll see a Maxwell coffee can. Up above, barely discernible, is a Prince Albert tobacco can. These were things that were left by the rescuers as they tried to get Floyd out. Nobody obviously having been down there since 1925. Here is where Floyd was. This young woman, after 26 hours of digging, managed to move her body back under this limestone rock in much the position that Floyd rested in 1925. You will notice to get to her, you must go in head first. If you went in feet first, this area is no wider than your body, and you can't bend over to get down to her. And now you appreciate some of the problems that the rescuers faced. You might ask, well, why was it that we got down to where Floyd was when other people couldn't get to Floyd because of a cave-in above his head early on in the rescue? And I have to tell you, as this slide will show, that we found off to one side a 9-inch crack through which some of our youngest and smallest cavers were still able to wriggle. And if rescuers in 1925 had probed around a little more, they might have found this, and they might have continued to give Floyd food and hot drinks, which might have kept him going, and they might ultimately have been able to save his life. But that's speculation, and that gives you some of the background to what we were doing.
Bob, if Floyd Collins were trapped today in Sand Cave in 1980, could he be saved?
Well, that question is often asked. There's a difference of opinion among the top cavers. Some say, yes, they think so, because there's a variety of techniques now that can be used, small trusses that can be used to keep openings cleared, angle irons that can be set up to keep the ground from caving in, and of course immediately they would have maintained constant voice contact with him. They would have set up field telephones, for example, which was not done and could have been done in 1925, and they would have set up feeding tubes to Floyd so that even if cave-ins had occurred, communication and life-giving energy could have gotten to him. Now there are others who say the condition that Floyd was in, the way he was trapped, that it still is possible that a person could not have been saved in time. So that answer is still not definitive. I would suggest, however, you not go get caught like Floyd was and try it.
In terms of good caving practices, what did Floyd Collins do wrong?
Well, I guess that's what we should say about how not to get in Floyd's condition. You don't go caving alone. You always take along with you several sources of light, which Floyd did not have. Obviously, you wear protective headgear. You also tell people where you're going and what time you intend to come back. These are just normal safety procedures that are now used by all good cavers. And Floyd, being a lonely caver, solitary caver, a man who had done this throughout his life, of course he thought he was doing nothing out of the unusual, but he was taking a chance and he paid for his folly.
Just a kind of an idle question. If Floyd Collins had been one of the rescuers instead of the trapped man, could he possibly have gotten a trapped victim out of there?
Well, Floyd was undoubtedly an expert caver. I would choose to think probably not, because there were equally expert cavers who tried to get Floyd out. Certainly Johnny Gerald was an expert caver. Homer Collins, his brother, was no slouch as a caver. Skeets Miller would be the first to admit that he was a rank amateur. But in 1925, we came to the conclusion that nobody could have saved a person trapped as Floyd Collins was.
Well, in your narration of the slides a minute ago, you moved from the individual rescue efforts to the shaft.
Yes.
And I think that overlooks the various levels of controversy
Yes.
that were going on the surface about how best to get him
Yes.
out. Maybe if you elaborated on the controversy between the Johnny Geralds and the Carmichaels, we might see a little bit more about how what was happening at the time.
All right, thank you, Tom. That's exactly right. The local people, obviously, they felt that the best way to get Floyd out, and Mr. Brucker and I also think so, was to have continued through the existing opening and to have worked there, to have kept relatively few people or allowed relatively few people to go in who knew what they were doing, thereby not disturbing the cave. After all, one thing they did, every Tom, Dick, and Harry was going in and out of there, knocking rocks down, etc. That it should have been controlled, that trips should have been planned, that they should have been conducted only by people who knew something about the Kentucky caves, that this should have been allowed to work without outsiders coming in and disturbing things. Now, when outsiders arrived, they naturally set up a tension with the locals in saying the locals didn't know what they were doing. They would never get him out that way. And right away they wanted to talk in terms of digging huge pits, and they wanted to bring in huge moving machinery and whatnot. Homer tried to tell them the fragile condition of the existing passageway couldn't stand the thumping of modern machinery, and it wouldn't. It would have caved in on his brother. He tried to tell them that they would be too late in trying to dig a shaft down because of running into limestone boulders and the condition of the soil with the early thaw that was going on. That tension ultimately got to the place where the local people began to remove themselves, sit on the hillside, while the experts came in, driving them out, so to speak, and began to do their own thing. The net result was considerable difficulty and possible conflagration from time to time.
Well, it seems to me, for instance, that if the shaft was the way to do it, then it started way, way too late.
It certainly did.
And that leads me to another question, and that is, if anybody has reviewed the contemporary literature on Floyd Collins, the news accounts and everything else, there was a growing body of mythology within 4 or 5 days about what was happening to Floyd.
No question.
And I'm interested here in getting back to the process of writing the book about Floyd Collins. As a historian, going back into the past, what benchmark of truth could you find in Floyd Collins? I know there was a court of inquiry convened on the second
Yes.
Monday. Where is your point of reference in this shifting sandy cave?
We had a very, very difficult time. That's a very good question. What we did, I think of it as much like a mariner at sea. We didn't take any one thing. We took a whole bunch of triangulated shots, as you would on stars, and somewhere in that cocked hat that you got, we felt the truth existed. For example, we did take the court of inquiry testimony, which was taken right at the time and was probably some of the best evidence we had. We had some reporters who were very reliable. Skeets Miller proved to be a very reliable source. After all, he was down there, he talked to Floyd, he was one of the rescuers. We also had testimony by some of the people at that time to the press, and reporters would report what so-and-so said about his trip into the cave, and we looked to see whether that was fairly reliable from what we could ascertain was the truth, and see whether that person indeed told the truth in one instance, were they likely to tell the truth in another instance, and that way we could weed out the people who tended to prevaricate and those who didn't. In the end, we had to rely very heavily on oral history, and you know what that's like. I mean, there is a certain amount of mythology that enters into that. In the end, in some instances, as I indicate, we simply had to put all these things together and then reconstruct it as best we could on the basis of what available evidence we had, admitting, well, maybe that wasn't the whole truth. I have to admit that.
Well, here we are 50 some odd years later, 55 years later, I guess, just passed. And it impresses me that what we've got entrapped is not just a historical account, but a sort of restructuring of the of the myth. I mean, you go into Floyd's state of mind in instances where we obviously don't have any testimony, and you've got an essential fictional construct in the framework of history.
That's true.
And I guess, you know, here we've got the historian as poet trying to shape and give meaning to an event that's 55 years in the past. Why Floyd Collins in 1980?
Well, I became interested in Floyd Collins because when I wrote an earlier book, I ran across the fact that the Floyd Collins story was the third most important single news event in American history between World War I and World War II. And right away, I was interested, well, what were the other two major stories that outranked this one? I hadn't paid much attention to Floyd Collins up to that time, and discovered, much to my amazement, that the other two major stories were, one, the Lindbergh flight, which everybody knows about, and secondly, the Lindbergh kidnapping at Hopewell, New Jersey, which everybody knows about. And that made me think, good heavens, if Floyd Collins was the third most important one, not everybody knows about that one or remembers that one to that extent, and that was my point of departure. So we decided to go back and take a look at it, and then we ran into all these problems.
And then as you run into that, you discover that Charles Lindbergh was here too.
That's exactly right, which amazed me. I did not expect that. When I found that in the accounts, I wondered, well, this is a strange irony of fate, isn't it? By the way, talking about Floyd and reconstructing these things, one of the things I had to do, not being a caver, was to do some caving myself. And as a consequence, Mr. Brucker, who collaborated on the book, took me to Crystal. We went in, he took me in the lower levels of Crystal to give me some feeling for what it's like to be in a cave without lights, in a narrow space where you can feel trapped. And at that point, while I don't know exactly what is true, I can tell you that I can imagine the terrors that this man went through while he was there. How he was able to stand it as he did, that's truly remarkable, truly remarkable.
Why do you think he was able to endure in the cave for as long as he did?
Well, Floyd's personality was a low-key, rather phlegmatic personality. He was not an excitable type. That's one thing. So I think his heredity, genes, chromosomes helped him, first of all. Secondly, he must have been a truly remarkable physical specimen for 37 years old. He must have been very healthy, very strong. Third, Floyd was used to caves. This was not the first time he was caught in the dark. This was not the first time he had been trapped in a cave. And as a consequence, he didn't meet this as a fright prospect like, let's say, I would, terrified before I'm even trapped, let alone when I'm trapped. So that certainly played a role. And the other thing was, I think Floyd had a great deal of faith, a great deal of confidence in his own ability to handle his life and get himself out of jams. And I think for a long period of time, Floyd really believed that he could be rescued and that people were helping him and that they were going to get him out. Even so, one has to admit that on a sheer basis of the medical problem involved, Floyd Collins survived in this environment long beyond the time when the normal person would have expired.
And I don't know that we've explicitly mentioned it, but this rescue attempt from the time Floyd was first trapped until they finally reached the body was something on the order of 17 days.
17 days. They estimated that he died in the 15th day.
And we know he was fed through about the 5th day, is
That's
that
right. He received food and water and hot liquids up to about the 5th day. From the 5th to the 15th, when it was estimated that he died, the man was away from contact with humankind. He had no food, and he had no water, although we guessed that maybe the groundwater dripping on his face, as it was in a kind of a Chinese torture, that he may have gotten his mouth around to have gotten some of that. It's unlikely that he would have survived without some kind of water.
You mentioned, talking before the show, that Brucker surmises that he may have been drowned.
Yes.
Ultimately.
Yes. While the shaft was being dug, there were some very heavy rainstorms that occurred. As I say, it was thawing. it was melting. So not only did you have the normal groundwater that percolates through the limestone seams of this country, but you also had actual water on surface of the ground running into the shaft itself. For a time, they had to run pumps 24 hours a day to get the water out of the shaft, and at times it was 3 feet deep in there where they were digging. And it's quite possible that the water leaking down through, moving into the sand cave passageway, which was right close by, that Floyd plugging that passageway anyway, may indeed have been drowned. You saw the picture of the young lady. I said she had dug back in there. What she dug out was silt. And obviously it was a water course, and silt had moved into that, and it's quite possible Floyd may have drowned.
Another thing that occurred to me when I was reading the book, you talk in the epilogue about your trip into the cave and where he was trapped, and about finding this 9-inch passageway. There was a cave-in while Floyd was
Yes.
trapped. The earth was unstable.
Yes.
And I wonder if there's any indication that 9-inch passageway maybe was not there in 1925.
Yes, we considered that problem. By the way, Tom, let me say right off the bat, I did not get down to the sand cave. But let me make that clear.
Yeah.
Our young cavers did. Even Mr. Brucker did not get clear down to where Floyd was, which tells you something about the narrowness of this passageway from time to time. There were spots where it was only 11 inches, and for some distance. I went in, got a few feet, threw up, and decided that I was not the caving type. The answer to your question is, we think that it was there because Johnny Gerald, in the very last stages of the rescue, was still trying to get through an opening, and he took down a grease gun with him and a variety of other things that we take to mean he found a very constricted area and was trying to get himself through there. And then when a rock fell on him at the end, he said, "That's enough, I can't go any farther, I've lost my nerve," and he went out. But we believe that Johnny Gerald may have found that place, but did not go through it. Also, when they made the survey for the shaft, and they went down in and laid out the survey so they could tell where to put the shaft to get to where Floyd was, the engineer who made the survey talked about being able to see a light. And Floyd did have a light on his chest that had been put there early on in the rescue, that he could see a light through what was called the breakdown. And therefore, if he could see a light through there, it was not totally packed. And it may have been this, which was just off to one side of where the breakdown was. So we've surmised, and it's speculation, isn't it, Tom? We've speculated that that's the same one. Now, heaven knows, in 50 years, the ground could have settled, shifted, and so forth, and it could have opened up.
What about Floyd Collins' plight, or about America in 1925, made this such a big story?
Well, first of all, it's a period of yellow journalism, isn't it? The press was vying for newspaper coverage. They wanted subscriptions from readers. The Louisville Press, you had 4 newspapers in Louisville alone, for example, and they were just scrabbling with each other to try to make the Floyd Collins story as exploitative for purposes of their press as possible. But it was true in the other cities, the Chicago Tribune, all over the country. This phenomenon was going on, and it's a predecessor, is it not, to much of the press hullabaloo that we associate with the Roaring '20s. So that's one factor. The other factor is it is a time when Americans had a proclivity to make heroes out of most everybody. This is the age of Lindbergh, the age of Babe Ruth, the age of Tilden, the age of Bobby Jones, the age of all kinds of heroes and heroines. And Floyd Collins fit into the pattern. He was picked up by the public and enjoyed by the public as a hero. It's also the fact that then more subtle possibilities. The American people at this time are going through rapid social and economic and cultural changes. And Floyd was kind of a throwback to the old frontier. It's a kind of a Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett part of the country. People tended to identify with their past when they were moving into a more urban, mechanized, sophisticated society. And here was a simple Kentuckian going about his business, doing these sorts of things. And he had tremendous appeal to a person, whether he was in New York or whether he was in San Francisco. It's one of these phenomenon.
One interesting thing about that, Floyd had a theory. The reason he was there, of course, as you said earlier, is that he either thought Sand Cave was connected to Crystal, or that he could develop Sand Cave and leapfrog the new entrance and Mammoth Cave and get out close to Cave City. And after Crystal Cave was sold by the Collins family to the Thomas family, there was some fairly extensive exploration done in that period, all from the late 30s up until the Cave Research Foundation was organized.
Yes.
And then after the Cave Research Foundation, about the time they came into being, they began to make those connections with Bill Austin and some of the things that Brucker was involved in. And Bill Austin, I might mention, is a member of that Thomas family that bought the cave and is quite a cave explorer in his own right. And a lot of Bill's work and a lot of that first Cave Research Foundation push was simply a matter of finding where Floyd Collins had been in Crystal Cave.
They proved Floyd's theories.
That's right.
They found, after all, it was not until the 1940s that some of these people got to where Floyd had been back in the late 1919s, prior to 1920 and into the 20s. And what you found has been true, that Floyd's ideas about caves in central Kentucky was absolutely on the beam, that they are indeed one great big labyrinthine connection. And Floyd was on target. He had the right idea. As a Kentuckian who had no training in geology, had no training in some of these subtler, finer points of hydrological levels and so forth, Floyd was amazingly accurate, as were many of the others, like the Austins and the earlier Turners and so forth, who uncovered this country here. Right. Remarkable.
And we talk about Floyd violating modern rules of cave safety and cave exploring practices, and in effect he was perhaps setting those standards and the need for those rules.
Yes. In a curious way, Floyd was a horrible example of how not to be a good caver, and yet was one of the finest cavers that this country has ever known. Yes, it's ironic.
What impact do you think the coverage, especially the Floyd Collins incident, what impact did that have on the popular image of Kentucky in 1925?
Well, I think it had both a positive and a deleterious effect. The positive effect was that it brought central Kentucky before the nation's attention, and certainly gave a tremendous impetus to what came to be the formation of the Mammoth Cave National Park. Floyd Collins, in his death, so to speak, was a great advertisement for the Kentucky caves. On the other hand, it did give to the nation a spectacle of a disaster in central Kentucky that caused many Americans to say, well, what could you expect from backward Kentuckians who, and much of that came from the experts, who, you'll notice, were no more successful at getting Floyd out than were the locals who first tried to do so. So their record was certainly not outstanding.
I'd like for you to touch a little bit more on, well, to call it cave wars is to fly in the face of some people who were involved in it who still don't like that terminology, but the competition between these local cave owners, and we need to remember the Mammoth Cave was another private cave at the time.
At this time.
Touch a little bit on that cave controversy, the competition that went on in Floyd's day.
Well, Floyd was part of it. and it certainly was remarkable. They used every ruse, every Halloween trick, every conceivable joke they could to siphon tourists off to their particular enterprise rather than to another. We don't have time to go into it, but I would hope that a place like Western Kentucky, for example, could be a repository for that kind of information. That's beautiful local color and magnificent local history, which ought to be preserved and not be lost. And there are people who still know that. We can talk to them, and that ought to be saved, because it's fascinating. That would make a good book of its own, just on the Kentucky Cave Wars.
Right.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we're about out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Murray.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Tom.